All right, we are back again here. I am Jen. I've got Kyle and I've got Pavel Samsonov here. And as usual, we're going to just let him introduce himself to get started.
Hi everyone. Glad to be here on the show in the swamp, as they say. I'm Pavel. You might have seen me around on the internet. Currently, I'm a principal experience designer at JustWorks. Before, I've been at NNG, at Amazon, Bloomberg, in various roles from user experience to product management to kind of innovation consulting. So I've brought all of those perspectives together into this weird thing we call design practice. And quite honestly, when people ask me what I do at work, I just say I do my best. And I think that is very true for everyone in this field, everyone in this world, to be honest. I got a little philosophical, but let's move on.
I mean, that's the name of the game around here. I so part of why I wanted to have you in the mix among all the other conversations we have here. Well, I should first off say I think Pavel and I know each other foremost from design Twitter days. So that's the connection is largely that I thought to myself, here is a person who strikes me as both knowing what we mean when we talk about working in the swampy lowlands, being in it, and not being afraid to get some of the ideas that we talk about around here, like dirty, in the doing of things. But also that there's a very clear, maybe sensitivity to or appreciation for a lot of the complexity-ish ideas that we toss around here a lot. And, Pavel, you probably see this too, but I think there are lots of pockets of design that are doing and figuring out and describing forms of sense making, forms of complexity, kind of savvy practice, without using the same language as each other. So my thought was, hey, here's a guy who's actually out there doing all the stuff. You're probably deeper in the weeds on a lot of this than even we are, because you're in an organization and have been in organizations where you're at the, I think of the Titanic. I'm like, you guys are in the boiler room, where I haven't been in the boiler room in a little while. So I'd be curious just to start with this very broad and like non-pointed prompt, which is to say, what the heck do you have in your mind walking into a conversation with me and Kyle about complexity, about sense making, about design? Where's your brain on all this?
Well, I've been following you for a little while at this point. I think I've actually featured some of your stuff on the Product Picnic newsletter more than once. And I think that, you know, complexity is really the topic that design has been putting off dealing with for the past, I don't want to say for the past decade because it's such a convenient round number, but it's probably been somewhere around, 12 years. Really, when we got into the thick of design thinking and everyone thought design is going to change the world, and then they had to move from the beautiful and clean world of sticky notes into the actual practice of getting things done in the world. And that is where things fell apart, and we got scared, and we said, let's just move rectangles around in Sketch and then in Figma, and now there is a little thing called Claude that moves rectangles around for you. And designers are being told, well, this is actually good because now instead of rectangles, you can do strategy, but no one knows what that is anymore. And the people who do know are waiting for permission from other functions to do strategy. So we're kind of stuck in a weird place, and every direction seems equally viable because they are all equally difficult to move in, which is certainly one of the facets of complexity and of that world.
So what are we
Why do you?
supposed to do? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kyle. Let's go right at it. What's the solution? What's the
Yeah,
answer?
no, that's that. There's so much there. Well, I'm wondering where you started. Why do you think that was avoided for the last 12 years or so? What is it about complexity that is pushing people away? Why not just as soon as we discovered it? Why not just grab it by the horns? Not discovered, but you know what I mean. Once we sensed that we needed to tackle it, why not?
I think the foundation of every single problem of this type is a combination of culture and incentive structure. And, I've kind of butted horns with some people over this in terms of where does culture in a company come from? I think that there's something to be said about bottom-up kind of culture, but I think that the majority of it comes from executives and comes from leadership who model the kind of culture they want the company to have. Anyone can go up there and say, cool, I read Radical Candor. We are now a Radical Candor organization, and it's almost never going to be true. Or they can go and they can say, we just fired our 3 middle management layers. We're going to be a flat hierarchy, and that's also never going to be true. So the incentives those leaders create and the behavior they model shape to a significant extent the actual work that gets done. And the problem with any kind of complexity is that it's not visible, it's not salient to anyone involved with setting goals and doing work. It's super easy to set a goal that is just release some features or, draw some mock-ups and show these mock-ups or these features to the people in power and then say, wow, you're so productive, you've done so many of these things. And engaging with complexity in any way slows down the rate at which you can produce these outputs. Because to appreciate the quality of an output, you actually have to have understood why it's complex, why the situation actually requires a nuanced solution. You need to do research, you need to do synthesis, you need to do all these different things that don't come across as productive to people who are not also doing those things. And so engaging with complexity in a way is detrimental to hitting these output metrics. And so the people who did not do that were the ones who got promoted, and eventually we staffed an entire industry with people who optimized for delivering outputs that other functions requested from us.
Oh, all right. I think we can just call it right there.
Just clip that. That's it. We'll
Yeah.
put that on LinkedIn and be done.
That's our first clip. Yeah. Jen, you were going to run with something.
Well, I mean, so what I appreciate is the way that you've called out, talking about culture, talking about incentives. You didn't just talk about culture as, oh, it's the problem. And you talk about modeling, and it isn't as simple as when a leader says, hey, everybody should make sure to use their vacation. Watch, I'll go do it, right? It isn't just the modeling. It is also what those incentives show up as inside a system. And I guess I'm curious because, I'm curious what you see, and I think, Pavel, you have a little bit more perspective from different angles of the field. Especially, I appreciate in your newsletter. You guys should all go read. If you don't, Product Picnic, we'll put a link. But there's a number of people who you draw on any given episode or issue around a given topic, and I think that you have visibility into some of the places that are still more blind spots for, say, me. But I'm curious, when you talk about incentives, when you talk about whether an org or an entire discipline has optimized itself for kind of the wrong thing, how does that land? How do people in Pavel's world engage with that? Do they go, yes, duh? Or are they kind of like, I don't think I see it that way? How is this looking out in your neck of the woods?
I've honestly never had anyone push back against the concept in general. The place where it's landed the worst has been at Amazon, where it's a very diametrically opposite culture. It's the kind of culture that honestly feels very, not even 2008, it feels very early 2000s, late 90s, where it's, that's when kind of the company was getting, transforming from a bookstore into a actual big tech giant. And I think a lot of that culture has stayed with it, where it's putting a lot of emphasis on two words that have kind of become a little bit more than they seem, which is people who are technical and people who are builders. And at the end of the day, that just means outputs. Technical means your outputs are in code, and builders means that you produce them. So there is kind of a very strong cultural bias towards just making stuff and
Yeah.
not really asking about why or who needs it or what it's for. And in that environment, talking about incentives doesn't land so well because the building is kind of seen as its own reward, where it's like, well, of course you should make stuff. Making stuff is what you're here for. Making stuff is what all of us are here for. And somehow that is meant to transition into, rewards or,
Yeah.
um, you know, promotions and recognition. And actually, what ends up happening as a result is marketing. Internal marketing is actually the name of the game. People talk about builders, but the building is not the thing. It doesn't actually matter who builds anything. The important thing is in a culture like that, and it's not just Amazon, a lot of startups are like this too, but Amazon is probably the best example from my career where taking credit for something and kind of going on a roadshow with it and being seen as the person who did the thing is how you get rewarded.
Hmm.
And the result is that a lot less effort and thoughtfulness actually goes into the thing that was made. And trying to explain to people within that kind of environment about incentives doesn't really work because they're very aware of what the incentives are. But their persona of the builder kind of requires that they pretend they don't understand it.
Yeah.
And it's just not a very fruitful conversation.
Jen, I have a question for you. Do you see this in your world? Because I'm an internal guy as well, and
Yeah.
this is you're singing my song, Pavel. Like, I I caught on to this because so many times I was fixing the thing that was delivered 3 years ago, and there was no regard for, well, what's adoption look like, and then how do we adapt to the user base, and all of that sort of stuff. It was just deliver, 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 and then fire and forget, or ready, fire, aim is what we used to say at Capital One all the time. And so it was, yeah, why didn't we consider this, like the structure? Once we've tossed it into the ocean, now what happens afterwards? And so that's how I became really sensitive and working in this space. But I don't know, is that just an internal, like, familiarity, or do you see this as a consultant coming in for a brief period of time and then stepping out?
I mean, I definitely see this dynamic too, but I am orienting to it differently than, being an internal and permanently internal member. I mean, because even though I guess I would still say, yeah, I'm an outsider, but I am not the type of consultant that wants to actually operate like that consultative kind of, right? It's just not how this work works. So, you can be in it, but not of it, or whatever phrase you like to use for that. So the short version is yes, but it just comes from a different orientation. And I joked about the Titanic, but that's probably actually a good way to think about it. There were brief stints of my career where I have been internal. Yes, basically living and breathing it. But it was also, I don't know, whatever it was now, 10 years ago. So it's been a while. I've been in professional services consulting, angle for a decade or so, if not more. And I used to spend more time in the the boiler room, so to speak, where the stuff is getting made, where the makers and the builders are making and building and shoveling coal and code into things and putting mock-outs and building, whether it's software or something else. But lately, because so much of that feels like it has been, well, to the way that Pavel was describing it, it has been optimized for a certain kind of practitioner, a certain kind of practice. So it's like a self-correcting kind of system at this point. I am now invited into the boiler room less and less often, and it's like, I don't know, I'm probably whatever that when they do the dancing, where they go to relax afterwards, and where the real stuff gets talked about, you know. So I'm not on the upper decks, but I'm definitely in that. And because of that, that's why I ask these questions, and especially with some of the different career stops that Pavel's made along the way, it does look and feel different to be in it. I mean, even Kyle, when you talk about your time at Cap One, but the interactions you guys had with some of the other outside consultants who came in versus some orgs that really don't invite outside help, who don't work with vendors or consultants much at all. It's almost like I'm just trying to like spy inside, you know, where these orgs are actually operating at a level they won't let others see because they don't feel they need it. Again, not because we've got some big mission. And I was going to ask you, Pavel, like what would you say to someone? It's not necessarily a given that Amazon's model should get blown up and changed. I mean, the three of us probably agree that it should for various reasons. There are things we might feel about Amazon in general, but what would you say to people who are like, yeah, so what's the problem with that?
I mean, one of the things that I would say from a little bit of a selfish perspective as a UX designer is this system is a system that discourages UX. Any kind of user experience work, generally speaking, just because the feedback loop that exists is a feedback loop between the stakeholder and the quote-unquote builder. The user is not really involved. You just show up and you show a cool demo, and the stakeholder is like, neat, that's awesome, ship it. But also, just generally, because in this kind of workflow, as a, you know, software is usually built with multiple people. Developers, typically a designer and a product manager. So we're always outnumbered. And in this kind of model, usually design is not invited, as you say. Design is treated as an external resource that serves product and engineering. And design is invited when product and engineering believe that design is needed to do the thing they want to do. And historically, design has been needed for a lot of things. And those things were kind of winnowed away more and more until we were just there to produce mock-ups, and now we're not even necessary for that. And so when you have this kind of model, what happens is designers go to product teams and they say, hey, I want to be involved with defining this product. And we're told, why? Why do we need to spend time explaining what we're trying to do to you and then waiting for you to do the thing? And I've written about this and talked about this periodically, because that's really what's been shaving away at the practice for the last couple of years, is this kind of idea of the fastest gun in the West, where the person who can get their thing in front of the stakeholder and get kind of across the line first wins. The idea that gets on the roadmap wins because it's the default, and then everything becomes compared to the default. And designers have been trying to play that game by shaving down our process more and more and more and more, but we can never be faster than not involving design at all. It's just not going to happen. Even like anything that we do, even if we anticipate somehow magically what everyone else wants, it's still going to take more time than them just ignoring us and doing their own thing.
Yeah.
And so the result of all of that, and you know, anyone who's been using Amazon, which is quite a lot of people, has been the recipient of this kind of degradation of user experience. Like, this is why I laugh when people, they say, oh, let's just do it like Amazon does it. You should never do anything like Amazon does it, because you are not Amazon, and the problems you are solving are not the same problems that Amazon is solving with its design decisions.
Right. That's right.
Whether or not they're good design decisions, you don't have the context for why they are good. But also, a lot of them are just bad. And, you know, it's very Amazon that different teams kind of go off on their own and do things, and very few of them have design resources, and very few of them use their design resources correctly. And the result is just a very low quality user experience in many, many, many parts um, of the company's many products.
So the like ticker tape that is running through my head right now is basically screaming about when we've talked on this program before, Kyle and I, about how I probably am in many ways biased in my perspectives through obviously my experience, but also even my entry, my on-ramp into design was at Carnegie Mellon. So I drank the Carnegie Mellon Kool-Aid like some others of us, right? And there was a like serendipity to the fact that the curriculum when I was there really built heavily on top of systems and some complexity thinking. And I was able to speak that language fluently because I already had the physics background. So there was both the luck in terms of the curriculum that I just happened to, the door I walked through into design was shaped like complexity. And I had the key to be able to open it easily. So not everybody has one or both of those things. But as all of the dynamics that you've been describing have played out over the last decade or so, the thing that always sort of just is so visible to me is how I see so many in the design field lamenting everything you're saying, gnashing of teeth, wailing, and some folks, they go, well, screw this, I'm going to go become a blank. They pick a different title. They pick a different job title, within design or adjacent to design. And others are trying to convince people that they need to, define design differently, which, as you've said, is there's never going to be anything more efficient than no design. So, and I can't help but wonder, most of the time when I hear people say, all designers need to become systems thinkers, which whatever that means, or the solution and the direction, all roads need to point to systems and complexity. If you're in design and you're not coming with a complexity mindset or consciousness, what are you doing? And I usually really bristle against that. But just talking about this right now, I'm kind of like, I don't know, man. Is there something to be said for, if design is kind of the rendering of something, pick your favorite second half of that phrase, is the problem rendering? Is the problem being attached to the notion of rendering? And what does it mean to render differently? And I don't know. I'm like completely off on a tangent, but it's an interesting thing that this conversation is actually making me almost reconsider accepting when people say, if you're a designer, you shouldn't be doing design in 2026 unless you also have a systems-oriented approach to what you're doing, or you're never going to get to do the design you think you want to do.
So there's two things that you've touched on that I think are extremely critical to this moment. One is the idea that every designer should be a systems thinker. There's a quote from Joanna Weber from a year or two ago that's goes something like, it's unfair of companies to ask designers to teach executives the basics of business administration. It goes something like that. And that's honestly what I see a lot of designers having to do. Because a lot of executives, a lot of leaders within companies do not have a reality-based strategy. And if you are a systems thinker, that's good. If you are the only systems thinker in an organization, you're dead.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can do. You cannot force anyone to do anything.
Right.
And you cannot really even convince anyone to do the thing you want to do.
That's right.
So I think that asking designers to do yet another thing is counterproductive, because that thing is not the language the organization speaks. It's not the set of priorities the organization has. And it basically makes you even more of a weirdo and an outlier than designers are already.
Yeah.
So that's kind of counterproductive in the first place. And rather than trying to take on yet another burden and take on yet another role that we're supposed to somehow do within our 40-hour weeks, I don't think that just asking designers to do more things is the answer. Problems that lie within how the company is set up and how it is led are not our problems to solve. We can try. We're going to fail. And I think it's, everyone always comes to me and says, okay, so you've identified this problem. what's the solution? I'm like, the solution is not within design. We can't solve every problem. But the other thing you said, I think, is actually really, really interesting, is the rendering. Because I actually did a talk for my team recently internally about this, and at least this idea of craft. I hate the word craft. I try to avoid using it as much as possible. The only word I hate more is taste.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you to talk about that next.
In this particular case, I think there's actually a place for craft as a way of distributed cognition. I think that craft as a set of opinions about, how tasteful my rounded corners are is useless, but craft as a means, as an activity, as a means of thinking about a problem is an incredible asset that only we have, because it's really, really easy to write a requirements document or write a strategy that sounds super awesome. And it's like, we're going to have this list of features, we're going to get users to do this or that. And it only really starts to, gain a little bit of complexity and a little bit of resolution when you start making it. And when you start making it, you suddenly start to realize, hang on, all of these ideas are terrible. Some of them are actually mutually exclusive. No one's going to be able to use this. This is never going to work. And the wonderful thing about design is you can do that at super, super low fidelity really quickly. And this is where I think a lot of tools like Claude Design are going to be leading teams astray even more than they have already been. Because they do not expose those contradictions.
Yeah.
They don't show you the full degree to which reality is complex. They don't show you all of the detail in what you're doing. They kind of do their best, and they obfuscate the fact that the thinking wasn't done and the fact that these contradictions were not resolved. And you can never get rid of that complexity. You can only push it off into the distance. And sometimes you can push it off into the distance far enough that someone else has to solve it for you. And then, well, you're sitting pretty because you have avoided dealing with it. But now it's someone else's problem. Now the issue is that design is often the people that other people push the complexity onto. And so we can't kind of ship it down the line because we are the ones who end up having to solve it. And then you get into a situation where executives will say, well, our idea was really awesome. It was just the execution that was bad. Because you have been sitting on that idea for so long and trying to make it work and trying to push the dealing with the complexity off for as long as you can. And actually being able to come straight back to the exec, the following day or even, later in that meeting and be like, okay, let's unpack your idea. Let's drill down into it. Explain to me so I can explain to others what it is you specifically mean. And there are lots and lots of tricks for doing this. There's things that I've written about. There's things that I've taught people how to do. It's not the only way of doing this. But basically, it's sort of like a judo maneuver where you're trying to get them to a point where they start to themselves understand their idea is not good.
Yeah.
And for various definitions of good, the easiest thing to get them to at least start thinking about is my idea is incomplete. That there's more to the world that we need to understand before we can create some kind of value. And a lot of the time, executives don't think for that long. They kind of have an idea, they give it up to someone else, and then 6 months later, oh, the thing we shipped was bad. Well, it can't be my fault. For the past 6 months, everything was perfectly fine.
Yeah.
So being able to get to the outcomes more quickly, and sometimes the outcome is you scrap the idea, has nothing to do with avoiding complexity. Engaging with it as quickly as possible, a lot of the time, actually gets you to better outcomes. Because, what is it? Sturgeon's law, 90% of everything is crap. 9 times out of 10, the idea is going to be crap, and the less time you spend working on it, the better. But if your whole identity is tied up with crafting and being a builder, um, working on the idea is what you think work is shaped like. And so any idea is as good as the next, and then you kind of start working on it, and 6 months later or a year later, nothing has shipped, or something has shipped and it hasn't moved any metrics, or you're not even tracking metrics, and most likely you just moved on to doing the next thing. I mean, you spent 5 years at a company like that, and you look back and you think, I didn't accomplish anything. And, I mean, that's a luxury. Now you just get laid off 6 months in. And it makes your next job interview a lot more difficult, because people will ask, what have you accomplished? And you're like, well, I shipped a lot of stuff. But
Yeah.
who cares?
Yeah.
When you ship stuff for a manager who asks you to ship the thing, they're happy. You might get promoted off of that.
Right.
But when that manager is no longer the person driving that kind of evaluation of the work, like you're trying to explain to even a different org what you did, they're going to ask you, okay, so why did you do it? And the answer that the manager asked me to do it is no longer good enough.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Oh, sorry, Carl. Did you want to
No,
go?
no, no. Go ahead.
There's like two pieces of this that I wanted to also talk about. One is, it's interesting that I hear too what you're describing, and Kyle and I have talked a little bit about this, but there's just this narrowing, and I want to say almost narrowing the aperture, but not just in space, but in time, of course. And it's easy for us all to say everything is short-termism thinking these days. It's all about, driving to the next quarterly earnings call. And, that is like, we don't even say that at this point. But also just that same parallel dynamic unfolding for the individual practitioner, and who in his org he needs or she needs, or the who or the what that needs to be addressed or met. So again, even for an individual where it might have had sort of a broader aperture of, here are the constraints, here are the goals, here are the things we're trying to achieve together. But if it all kind of narrows down closer and closer into, as long as my direct boss likes what he's seeing, like, I'm surviving to the next paycheck, And I think I hear a lot of people articulating this in sort of imperfect / partial ways, and it seems to sort of be this universal thing we're experiencing. And you almost get that like tightness in the chest feeling as you think about the way that we are reducing where the incentives live in that narrower and narrower scope in time and space. And I don't think there's necessarily a solution to it, other than just, I hear I appreciate the like parallel with that and what you're describing. And the other thing I thought I would say is, I don't know, Kyle, if you pick up on this, but especially when you're talking about, Pavel, the helping people, or at least making it possible for people to kind of recognize on their own terms, what they're looking at, the complexity of the situation. It struck me, if we were to back up and replay some of what you were saying, you could talk about the Cynefin framework right here, right? And I mean, God knows we can't go a whole program without talking about Cynefin, but this is such, for our listeners, like, who, again, grow sick of me and Kyle on this is a really great example where, like, Pavel didn't say the word Cynefin. He didn't say the word clear or ordered or complicated or anything, but there's this sort of dynamic unfolding there whereby you're saying, hey, let's actually engage with this in a way and thoughtfully enough that you start to recognize what you've been assuming is a clear or ordered domain or challenge or what have you actually turns out to be complex or whatever, and you can get into the semantics of it. But you're not talking about following a process where you teach people Cynefin and you start to use the language, and that when you've got, a complicated system, we analyze and act, and if we've got complex, now we need to probe, sense, and respond. But what you're describing is exactly that. Probe, 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 build, 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 but do it in a way where what you're building creates learning and isn't just for the sake of it. So neither of those is anything more than an observation, but I thought I would connect those dots for any of the viewers that may not have kind of picked up on that, because the parallels are very strong to me. Sorry, go ahead, Kyle. Now it's your turn.
Yeah, no, that's sense making. No, two things jumped out at me as well. So it was interesting. You introduced yourself as you do your best. And I was reminded, we were saying that the complexity is landing on, has traditionally landed on the design org. And I was reminded that for a long time, I remember asking designers what they do, and they would say, I simplify complexity. Constantly. I don't hear that so much anymore. I don't know if it's still being said, and then just people in my orbit know not to say that shit around me anymore because I have responses to that, and they know now. But I think we brought that on ourselves through that sort of that rhetoric, and I don't know what to do about that. But it also reminded me of very early conversations that you and I have had, Jen, long before we recorded anything, where we were saying design doesn't have, we've complained about design not having a seat at the table forever. How are we going to go in and introduce this to an organization if we don't have the ability to say, you probably should do some research before developing a thing? How are we going to say, maybe you shouldn't work so linearly as well? Maybe you shouldn't have 9-month roadmaps anymore. Maybe we should be working iteratively, that kind of stuff. I kind of forgot about those conversations, but that's all coming back to me now. Again, just, it's, yeah.
Pavel, do you have a seat at the table?
Oh, that conversation.
So there's a reason that the newsletter is called the Product Picnic. And the reason is that at a picnic, there are no tables. You have your blanket, and then you've got your little basket full of goodies. So I actually wrote an article for JustWorks on our tech blog early this year around kind of the notion of what exactly is the seat at the table and what does it look like for design. I'm extremely critical of the framing of a seat at the table. As I mentioned before, the people who had this seat at the table were the people who basically sold out what we were doing to people who wanted outputs. And they said, yeah, sure, we can deliver you some screens. We can deliver you some features, in a week or 2 weeks. We can work 2 sprints ahead of engineering. And it was very easy for a time to get promoted as a leader who was essentially promising these things to other people and then going and asking their team to deliver it. And we are now finding out exactly what those leaders are worth, which is not very much. Because those are the leaders whose design organizations are getting gutted and who are not able to stand up to, other parts of the org and decision makers because they have never earned the kind of the trust and the influence and the power to actually make decisions. So they have a seat at the table, but they got there by buying into the things that everyone else at the table already believes. So they gained power, but they kind of at the same time made it impossible for them to use that power to do anything useful.
Man. Yep. Does
so
that not just sum up, like, literally, again, what I think so many folks are, like, maybe sad about? Mad and sad.
It sort of sums up the world.
Yeah.
But I think there's a much better way of looking at influence that isn't just fighting over kind of the zero-sum game of, well, I get to make this decision, you get to make that decision, I own this outcome, you own that outcome. Because that kind of thinking, it's very product management. And that's not like a bad thing. We need product managers. We need this kind of vertical domain-based ownership and to create focus around, building these things and making them work and releasing them. But I think design is much more suited towards a horizontal mode of influence. I don't want to say ownership, because it's not really ownership, but we're able to look across different domains, across different areas that different parts of the organization own. And what that lets us do is it lets us see the gaps between those areas of ownership. There's always gaps. Yeah. There's always things that kind of like, well, we had to compromise, we had to prioritize, and so this didn't get done. And you kind of get to a point where a lot of the ways in which a service works were designed essentially by accident. And no one owns it, so no one will ever fix it. No one sees it. No one's metrics are responsible, or no one's responsible for dealing with it, and no one's metrics show it, but the total experience as a whole is crap. And a lot of the influence designers can have, if they choose to use it, is to find those areas and kind of point them out and say, we need to fix this. It's clearly and measurably a problem. And no one's going to fight you on it because no one owns it. No one has like planted their flag in that territory. So when it comes to, saying, do I do or do I not have a seat at the table, I think that I don't want to fight over seats at the table because it will get me into a fight over politics. It'll get me into a fight where I'm not doing design, I'm doing meetings.
Yes.
My calendar is very light on purpose. I work really hard to keep meetings off my calendar so that I can actually do work. Meetings are part of the work, but the more you are in meetings, the less of other non-meeting work you can do. And you need that balance to be able to actually think. Meetings are very good for convergent thinking, which you need time to diverge. And the more you focus on trying to influence other people, the less of an ability you have to actually do design and do what I was talking about earlier, the crafting. And the less of an ability you have to bring something to a meeting that structures that conversation, to bring an artifact that people can look at and go, aha, and kind of change the way they think about something, update their mental model, integrate new information into how they make decisions. And if you're at kind of that traditional conception of the table, you're in the room where it happens, so to say, that's not the dynamic usually. The dynamic is around horse trading. It's a 100% pure politics. I will do this if you do that.
Yeah.
Unless you have the ability to set the agenda, which design never really does, even if they're in the room, you're mostly there to earn influence and to spend influence. And
yeah,
you have very little opportunity to do designing things. I like to say that the outputs of design are not visual, they're mimetic, because your goal really is to change the mental models of stakeholders. And visuals are useful for that. They're not the only thing. And you need to design the way you interface with people, with the deciders in your organization. I think that's from Peter Merholtz, or someone, one of those folks who kind of talks about org design, is one of the things you really have to double down on and do intentionally is how you interact with the rest of the organization. You have to design in a way your own table and invite the right people to it at the right time and have that conversation that doesn't necessarily look like a big boardroom meeting. And if you don't design that intentionally, you are now in a situation where you have an unintentional interface and you have lost like 90% of your leverage that you might have otherwise been able to exert upon the organization just because. And I prefer to use this metaphor rather than the metaphor of handoff, because you can hand something to someone, they're not obligated to take it, and then it just drops on the ground. And if you just think about your interface with your org as a handoff, that's what's going to happen most of the time. People give me like work all the time, and I'm like, I don't care, I'm not going to do this. And then it just kind of drops on the ground, and a lot of the time, no one follows up. And it turns out, hey, that work wasn't actually important. But, they haven't designed that interface in a way that actually gets people on board with what they want to do.
Yeah.
And especially if you work in an organization like Amazon of kind of builders and internal marketers who are, so you have to get good at marketing yourself and good at getting people to do what you want. You need to be doing this all the time, not just after the work is done, but even before the work is started, you need to be designing how that work is going to be used to make a decision, or how that work is going to be used to make yourself look good.
Yeah.
It's too late to wait until, hey, it's already in Confluence to start like road showing it.
Yeah.
Because then it's just going to stay in Confluence forever.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because as I'm listening too, I am thinking about, like you mentioned earlier, the one quote about how it's maybe not fair to ask designers to do a billion other things, like teach MBAs what they should have learned in their MBA program, or, become complexity science nerds, or whatever other things it might be. So, like at one end of the spectrum, I think there's a limit to what is appropriate to ask designers to take on outside of the literal craft of design, which is not even a thing, right? But I'm like, moving pixels in my weird gesture. And then on the other hand, I also, and I know you're a fan as well, like, for example, the way that Erica Hall talks about the business model is the grid. Like, you still have to understand and have a savvy around that in which your design practice is going to manifest something for someone, Otherwise, what are you doing? It's certainly not design at that point. You're just doing art, if it doesn't have a grounding in something, right, on the other side of what you're delivering or doing or accomplishing or achieving or making. And there's almost this kind of, I don't know if I would call it a gradient or a scale, but, I think there's a threshold at some point. It's, I need to incorporate a higher ratio of these other things that I may not have been taught to think of are part of design. They add power or influence, or they improve my ability to actually achieve desirable things up to a point after which putting energy into them is maybe not even appropriate for me to expect myself to do, but also counterproductive or useful, in the sense that they're taking away in a zero-sum game from time that could be on the things we should be doing. And I think about that threshold right now in this conversation. And I think about that threshold being both a personal thing, because I know there are humans out there who love the horse trading. They wanted to fight for the seat at the table because they like that table. They maybe entered through the design field, but really they want their job to be sitter at table. And then there are people for whom it's less a personal threshold and it is more for us as a field. What do we think is professionally appropriate for us as a field to hold for each other, And I don't know, I've never really thought about it in that way, especially because these days I almost don't know where I am at on that scale. I think I have stepped orthogonally off of it in some weird fashion that I don't know how happens, but I'd be interested if people watching or listening to this have thoughts on this as well. Where's your personal limit of, well, I am interested in the influence game. I'm interested in a systems view. I'm interested in the politics. I'm only interested in those to the extent of, for example, what Pavel's describing around designing the interactions internally that are going to lead to these desirable outcomes, but understanding that I'm also really just arranging conditions and I can't guarantee it, right? It's creating the likelihood of something to happen, but without knowing for sure exactly how they'll unfold. And I have to say, I don't know how most of my peers in the design world probably think about that right now. All I know is how people, self-made thought leaders, write about it and talk about it and post about it on LinkedIn, but I don't know how the day-to-day feels to people. So this is an interesting blind spot this is revealing for me.
Yeah. I think this kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier, where a lot of designers are, looking for some other title that will let them do more of the thing they want to do.
Yeah.
And there was a study recently, kind of motivated by the Claude coding of the various tech disciplines, and how much are developers actually accelerated by using a code generator. And the finding of the study was that software developers spend about 15% of their time on writing code.
Yeah.
15, not 50, 1-5, which is shocking to people who don't know anything about software development, and not at all surprising to actual software developers who understand that most of what they do is systems thinking. And I think for designers, it's actually a little bit more of our time is spent on the crafting. For product managers, I think it's a little bit less, but the parts, the time we spend on, that 85% of the time spent on other things, there's so much overlap between what we do and what developers do and what product managers do.
Yeah.
And so to me, this whole thing of learn to code, well, okay, that's not really going to help you.
Yeah.
Learn to, change your title to a product manager, that's also not going to help you. And I talked about this at Button and at Throughline and at IAC here and there, that product managers are not magic. There's no PM card, like the CIA or FBI thing, like badge you hold up and suddenly people let you have influence and let you do things. Product managers earn influence and product managers spend influence. And they do that through a variety of strategies that you don't need to have a PM title to do. And there's nothing stopping you from practicing those strategies as a designer or as literally any person anywhere.
Yeah. It occurs to me, though, that sounds like something a product manager would say in an attempt to keep the riffraff out. We don't have anything special over here. You go look over there. You know what else, too, though, as we're talking about this, and I was thinking about the earlier question when Kyle posed to me, as an outsider, where am I engaged? Lately, I am starting to encounter more folks, now whether or not they are actually part of a self-identified design organization or team or whatever or not, I would still characterize what they're doing as having a designerly component to their work. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be in partnership. But more and more, they are explicit about the output of their work is not a design or a designed thing or an intended thing in that sense. The output of their work are decisions. And they've let everything else, even the charade of other things, fall away. And they're willing to just say outright, literally, what do I as an individual do for a living? I either make decisions or I facilitate the making of decisions among people. And the decisions are the deliverables. And now it's not often that the humans are saying those literal words, but that is what I am seeing increasingly. I'm curious if the two of you, are you seeing this too? Is this unique in my world? Did I just work with some weird orgs, or is that dynamic unfolding in different places at different ways?
I've never seen anyone come out and say it that way, but I've been saying it for a very long time, where essentially there are two parts to doing design. You make decisions or you document decisions. And to me, making the decision is designing, and then documentation is not designing. Figma is a documentation tool because you make a decision elsewhere, in the meeting, at the table, through user research, through testing, and then you document it by changing the layout of the thing in response to that decision. You're not making the decision by changing the layout. I mean, you are a little bit because you're making decisions around visuals, but ultimately it's still downstream of the real decision. And a lot of people are now being fooled by AI tools because they can just press the button and a thing has been generated, but a decision was never made. And then your organization now has 100 of these generated things that don't particularly do anything, and it becomes impossible to tell, so what? And so I think that framing of I make decisions are my output, is supremely important and should be more popular than it is. Because making an output is now extremely easy. I don't want to say cheap. It's cheap time-wise. I mean, token costs are going up. But historically, it's been slow and expensive to make any output. And a big part of why it was slow and expensive is you had to make a lot of decisions, and you had to document those decisions. And then you had to make sure they were good decisions by testing them, and so on and so forth. And all processes were optimized towards making the first output as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And now that we've kind of been able to skip to an output, we don't know what to do with it. There's sort of this place of honor for an output. It's what my manager calls the fidelity cascade. You have an idea, and then you render that idea progressively in finer and finer and finer detail until it's fine enough detail to attach to a Jira ticket and someone else goes and builds it. We have a really good opportunity to jump off of the fidelity cascade and never look back, because I can now render something. And when I say now, this has always been possible. It's just now more visible to non-designers. That I can go and create a thing to test my decision, to get an insight out of it, and then throw it away because it didn't cost me anything to do it. I didn't put a lot of effort into it. I wanted to test the thing. I tested the thing. The knowledge is what we gained out of it. The actual artifact is not on the fidelity cascade. It's not something that you now have to go and build because what you wanted it for was the insight. And organizations that have structured themselves around the fidelity cascade have only really started thinking this way now because you can render something that is fully, high resolution and quote unquote clickable and interactive and all those things. Designers have always been able to do this. I can go and make a sketch of a storyboard and show it to someone, and in 30 minutes of conversation, I will come back with a ton of insights that will shape the next iteration of that thing. None of what we end up building is a higher resolution version of that storyboard.
Right.
That storyboard, the actual artifact, the documentation, is garbage. And I'm going to throw it in the garbage, and I'm never going to think about it again. But the decision and the knowledge we gain from it,
yes,
that's the deliverable. That is going to be documented. That is going to be something I take around with me to meetings and put it in Confluence and tattoo it on my knuckles and what have you. Your preferred method of socializing your knowledge. But the artifact doesn't matter. That it never mattered.
No.
And I think weaning people off of the idea that the artifact is the thing is going to be the saving grace of design.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that Claude Code and similar tools have accomplished, whether or not you use the tool, is that people are starting to understand that just because you have made a thing doesn't mean the thing needs to be built. Well, what else can you do with it? You can do research with it. And now you're back to where designers were 20 years ago, that you can do this little thing called research without going through production.
It's scaffolding. At risk of being one of those people, but let's not confuse the scaffolding, the temporary scaffolding, for the final thing we're building, the building itself. I will say it's interesting, Kyle, too. Do you find this when we encounter people who are into complexity, we'll say, but who have not come from a design or design adjacent field, it always strikes me that a big part of complexity informed practice emphasizes safe to fail experiments, probes, low risk, low cost, high learning, whatever you want to call them, right? Nudges, etc. And the folks who are not coming from a design background, I think, struggle a little bit. I won't say this across the board, but when I'm thinking of particular methods like Dave Snowden's estrogen mapping, which is a form of affordance mapping, which designers speak that language all day long, but for someone who's not familiar with it, it's ooh, this is a little bit. I find that it's that final kind of part of the process that folks struggle to go from. We've kind of mapped the landscape of affordances and constraints. We can see where it's a high, we have to climb this hill. This is really working against the terrain, or, this is going to be a downhill effort, and translating that last piece of it into, okay, what are this series, parallel portfolio of safe to fail experiments and probes can we design and implement? And the non-designers, this is still a kind of foreign chunk of this work for them. And I'm over here this is a place where design as an entire field can stroll right in by virtue of its entire, it's programmed into the DNA of design to be able to do exactly that. And I don't know, Kyle, we haven't talked about this a whole lot. We do once in a while, but it still strikes me today, even in 2026, the cult of complexity, in some ways, I say with love, and then the world of design and the concept of intervention design are still, there's a gap for that, for, to be crossed in terms of like, I have the key and I'm the key holder and I'm the lock, and it's like, why are these Venn diagram circles, why aren't they touching yet in terms of the way that these practices or the folks that find themselves wanting to perform them collaborating?
Yeah. So I noticed that. I think there's another intersection there that's interesting.
Ooh, a third one? A third circle?
Yeah. So I think so. There's obviously like a gradient. My lo-fi or my safe to fail experiment isn't everyone's safe to fail experiment sort of thing. Like, I know we can whiteboard something and do a role play and get some insight from that and pivot, and like, I know the effectiveness of that. We've done it in workshops. Not everyone has that experience, understands how to facilitate those sort of things. So that's a design muscle that the whole complexity community doesn't necessarily carry. But I think there's also, I think people that bring a sort of DIY experience with them in other creative pursuits, experiences, they can show up. I've seen some of them show up and kind of like, yeah, we're going to farm stand or like farmer's market stand this sort of approach. And it might not be quite my low fidelity, but it's still in the realm. I've seen some folks be able to grab that. But to your point, I think there's still, that's, being able to connect those dots is still a little bit of a stretch. I think this is still a function that we provide at the end of the day that is really important in this space.
Are designers getting that experience? So I'm thinking now, I mean, again, we keep talking vaguely about the state of the field right now, and we say it with like a sad face or a Mr. Yuck face or whatever. But are people who've entered the field of design
so
in the last 5 years, are they even able to build that, let me just cobble this together ethic? I mean, between boot camps with everyone wants to hate on the boot camps, and but then there are fully like rigorous degree programs now that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago. Like, what is, this is pointed at either of you. I'm just,
well, here's something, Pavel, you were talking before about where we exist between the verticals and being able to connect a lot of those dots. And
interstitium.
That's
the interstitium. Right?
There you go.
Everyone's favorite new organ,
Yeah.
the interstitium.
So I totally agree. It's a slight reframing of how I've been talking about it for a long time, but what I have found in that world where this becomes really difficult is we become really inconvenient to what product sets out to do from day one. If they're not just delivering, they're delivering to meet those KPIs. That's what that, or they're delivering on time and on budget and all of those, that sort of stuff. But when we start talking about, let's have a safe to fail experiment, let's get DIY and get, a little scrappy, let's learn some stuff. And if we learn that we're on the wrong track, let's divert and go somewhere else. Unless there is some sort of intermediary that's saying, introduce some friction to your process, allow yourself the ability to be wrong and go off the path, there's no incentive to do so in a lot of cases. Somebody has to, like, now I cut my teeth in a bank, like the amount of product people that were sitting there saying, like, fuck, we have to go through audit, like compliance has to come through here, data governance has to come through here. Like, how do we do everything possible to avoid this and minimize the pain of this so that we can get through it as much as possible? When design shows up and says, hey, we're going to also add a little bit of rigor to your process, they're like, we are maxed on rigor. We've got the federal government. Who are you? You're optional rigor, and we're not selecting rigor today. Sorry. So, and then when you start talking systemically, like, hey, the thing you build is going to interrupt somebody else's business over there, they're like, I don't want to hear about it. That's not my problem. I'm accountable to deliver my thing. Unless there's some intermediary out there that is accountable for saying things need to flow, not just out the door for this one person over here. I need these things to connect and orchestrate neatly. And so I can't have these disruptions. I need somebody to go out there and be sensitive to them and inform the rest of us and create some of that friction. So it's difficult. We still need maybe not that seat at the table, but there does need to be some sort of power structure that says, yes and deliver with some caution, and somebody needs to be sensitive to, you're pulling a string. What else comes with it?
I have to just say very quickly though, when I hear you say there has to be maybe an intermediary or a person or people who are accountable for this or responsible for this, that's so dangerous, dude. Think about, I mean, think about, I know I've probably talked about this, but I'm thinking in particular about one particular client I've worked with. Very large health related enterprise. And they kind of did exactly that at one point when they recognized that parts of their org, each of whom had sort of their little siloed focus, and that was the way they were set up. But recognizing with increasing sensitivity that when this team does this to juice their performance metric, it might potentially hurt this team's performance on their metric. And they were recognizing this with a level of savvy that's lovely to observe as an outsider. And, I was in the mix to kind of help them almost kind of in some ways be that, but I wasn't there to be the connective tissue. Their solution, or one of their solutions, was to name a couple people and say, your personal success metric is making sure that these things, which are all connected, and when this goes up and this goes down, make sure we all know and make sure that the net is up, even if it's up 2 and down 1. The problem is those people were going to be held accountable, but they weren't given any kind of leverage. They weren't given any kind of power. They weren't given any kind of influence. And so they're basically being told, you're going to get graded for the group project, but you can't make the group members you're working with do anything. So you can imagine what happens. I'm sure that's
sounds very familiar.
That's got to be everywhere, right, at this point. So how do you actually do it?
Yeah.
I don't want to say immature, but it sounds immature. Not immature. Like it sounds like it's a
What's mature
early
look like?
step.
Is what I'm saying. What's mature?
Understanding that this is like understanding this better means it's not just a person that can wave a wand the way that we like to talk about wand waving, and it has to work. It's got to be the person that's accountable for making the orchestration work doesn't pass that accountability to an individual. It's the conductor of the orchestra that becomes accountable for orchestrating this. That would be something progressive from what you were looking at, because I've seen similar things, and to go back to the Capital One example, there was a lot of energy and effort put into how do we minimize our exposure in that audit process. We know the day they're going to show up, so we need to be careful about what gets documented before that day. They were very savvy as to how to,
of course,
to navigate that space.
And
so again, the optional stuff, they were phenomenal at. And then I had a client I worked with recently where I was doing data governance work, and everybody was really sensitive to, we need this. Things are going off the rails. It's the Wild West out here. And the answer was, why don't you do anything about it? You're in a position of power here. And they were like, I've got too much on my plate. I've got too many other responsibilities. And it's not me alone. There are 8 other people out here in the Wild West that are leaders that have power that can do it. Why does it fall on me? It could be any other of these 7, 8 people. And great. Well, that was sort of my final report to them, was bring the Wild West together somehow, organize.
Yeah, this is a bit from our good friend Deming around exactly this thing. And, this is like decades ago that everyone knows about, but no one's actually put into practice really, is review gates don't work. Having one person responsible for making sure that the thing is compliant essentially means that you've put them in an antagonistic relationship with the rest of the organization. And now people are going to have to either budget inefficiency and friction and cost, or work around them. And usually they pick the second one because it's easier. And, design is not ever going to be successful at, increasing the design maturity of our organization, or whatever you want to call it, by setting up review gates, or by coming to different teams and saying, hey, the thing you are working on at some point needs to be designed. The thing is designed continuously. You can't suddenly say, okay, everything you have done until this point doesn't count, or you have done it wrong, because there's too much inertia, there's too much power behind the thing that's already done, that fait accompli. You have to create a culture of quality. You have to create a culture of don't wait until the review gate for someone to tell you this is wrong, fix it from the beginning. And so when you actually get to the point when it's done and needs to be reviewed, you don't need to review it because you already know that it's good. The thing that makes it good was happening continuously. And then no one is kind of getting blamed for, oh, you're slowing us down. It's not an us versus them. And I think that is the structure of it needs to be set up in order for any of this to actually work well. Yeah. And it's not set up that way. It's really being treated in most organizations as, oh, the spoil sport, designer came and told us this is bad. Well, you're going to find out about it anyway. You're going to find out about it when you release it and your metrics go down. And the easiest way to avoid that is to obfuscate the metrics or not measure anything in the first place. And you kind of get to a point where you're essentially gambling that shit won't hit the fan in time for you to get your bonus and get your promo and then go somewhere else. And so the longer release cycles are actually really, really good because you can sit on your achievements for long enough to put them on your resume and then leave. And if things are tracked more frequently and more quickly, well, maybe you then find out that the thing you did was bad. And you can't outrun that in a culture where responsibility lies with the team that built the thing. But in a lot of places, this is one of my many beefs with the concept of build, measure, learn, is that that's three different teams. There's a team that builds things, and usually they're called software engineers, and then there's another team that measures the things, and there's another team that's responsible for learning. And notice that in none of those places are you actually talking about interpreting what you have learned into actions that need to be taken. So that loop is never actually closed, and part of it is because these are different functions of different teams. And so you are learning that the things you're building are crap, but they're never actually getting better because it's never feeding back into the people who are building the things. And if it does, then you are seen as the spoil sport. You're seen as that review gate that they try to avoid. Because their incentive is to build, and they see you as stopping them from building. And every conversation around velocity eventually ends up at this place where it would reduce my velocity to do a good job. And so anyone who's trying to make me do a good job is essentially taking money out of my pocket because I'm not going to get that promo or I'm not going to get that bonus.
Which raises the question I think a lot of people don't even really like to talk about, which is doing a good job is not always the organization's commitment. I think those organizations are shitty and I won't work for them. But I think there are a lot of folks who have to come to terms with the fact that in the economic environment that we live in, you can't take it as a given that people want to do a good job individually or organizationally. What is usually a given is that they want to make money. And then everything else can follow from there. If you are a publicly traded company, you are a financial company first and foremost, period. And what you produce is secondary to that, if not tertiary. And that's not me being my little anti-capitalist ranty self. I mean, I think that's the reality if you're a designer, is to understand everything that you've just said, is going to bear out based on the way that those priorities sit for an organization. And you can usually still find within that small little flywheels that are doing the kind of things that you want to support. But you've got to remember that business model is the grid concept right there if you're thinking about it in that way. And it strikes me too that you could clip this whole piece right here and say, even as far back as Deming talking about this, we can say this and we know it to be true, and you could like play this for people, but it's sort of this like terrible truth that people can't really internalize it until they experience it not working. They do it. They make someone the antagonizer, the gate, the person who's going to get the grade but can't make the other kids in the project do what they want, and that has to happen the wrong way before someone understands why that's not the way to go. But by the time that happens, you've now got the path dependency of having done it that way, and you can't undo that. You can undo the structure, but you can't undo the fact that you tried it once and it didn't work out that way. So there's like this terrible kind of paradox, like, I don't know, some kind of Hellraiser movie type trap.
Tragedy of the Commons.
No, I don't want to go there. It's not quite that. It's not that. It's not that dynamic. It's different. But
well, Pavel, you opened by saying that leadership models culture, and that extends outside the organization too. In regulated industry, this is how the regulators work. It's that culture of stage gates, and if you can manipulate it, that's great. Really, the audit that worked last year is going to be the audit that works this year. And if they change the goalposts, they're accountable for it. It's not the people being audited. So it's all about that gate. And it was eye-opening working with compliance in Canada, where they don't have everything heavily written out so you can navigate the text down to the letter. Instead, it was kind of like, don't be an asshole, and you're going to have to stand in front of a judge and explain what you did. And you're going to have to monitor this regularly to make sure that you're not like screwing people over. And that was kind of it. It was very vague, the way that they outlined things. And it made people stop and think, do I want to be the face of what we're doing here? Rather than in the US, where we sit down and say, are we covered by the things we're doing? And there is somebody that's translating law into the documentation, the representation of what we're doing. So yeah, it's beyond just our organizations too. But I think this is an interesting opportunity though, because if we think about this as a design condition, then we have to think about, so how do we frame good as something compulsory in what we're building, right?
I don't know if compulsory is. I mean, I think someone who works in a regulated space, I can see the framing is powerful. I want to avoid that framing because I think that design will never have the kind of power to mandate anything to anybody. And I don't think we would want to do that even if we could. I think that my personal belief, at least, is everyone wants to do a good job. No one goes into work and clocks in and sits down and opens their MacBook and says, I'm going to do a terrible job today. I'm going to really make terrible software. I'm going to make this thing that sucks. And it's going to be awesome. And I'm just going to be like really happy. And then you go, to the pub with your colleagues after work and you clink your glasses and say, yeah, we made a terrible software today. People don't think that way. And I think if we believe that people make bad software on purpose, we have no chance of collaborating with them effectively. I do think that there are two problems that stand in their way, one of which is that they don't really have a good idea of what good looks like. Their idea of good is shaped by the incentives around them and what they see recognized. And the other is that they have a limited understanding or limited view into how do you get to good. So it's like goals and methods are the two problems essentially. And I think that the way that we level up teams is not through mandating, it's not through publishing a big list of things, it's through modeling what we want to, the behavior we want to see in other people. A lot of, I would say the majority of people, certainly a large fraction of them, don't really have a very strong opinion either way. And unless they are forced to produce one, they're going to go with the flow. If design can kind of slip into those opportunities and create an opinion or create a perspective that seems tangible and it seems like good enough, people will adopt it. And then you become the default. And then any competing idea is going to have to fight against your default. You're kind of turning anchoring bias into something that's working for you instead of against you. But you need to catch that moment. Catching that moment is hard. It essentially requires you to be everywhere, and that's why it works very slowly. One of the recent newsletters I was talking about the garbage can model. Forget who it was who came up with that model, but it's essentially, I think they were using government as their example, but I think it really applies everywhere. Is the people who make the decision are the people who happen to be in the room when the stars align. There's no way to make sure that's you. There's no way to make sure that the data that they have in front of them is the right data. The thing that gets done is essentially the only thing that was possible to do in those circumstances. And so that's why this sort of low-level background influence is, I think, much more important than getting your way in a particular meeting room of leaders, because those leaders usually don't have any idea of what's going on the ground. Everything that gets rolled up to the next level of management is sanitized, then it's re-sanitized, then it's re-sanitized, and by the time it makes it up to executives, everything seems like it's going great because all the inconvenient metrics that look bad are carefully edited out or de-emphasized in favor of things that make us look awesome. So you kind of just really have to be doing a good job in the way that you define good, and kind of focusing your internal marketing efforts on that, on the idea of, this is how we know that we are successful. This is how we feel good about. This is why we can feel good about the work that we do. And it's not just, I made this thing much more quickly. You need to be able to get to the point where a product manager vibe coding something can then also look at the thing that was vibe coded and say, no, this is bad. This does not satisfy the bar that we have set for quality.
Yeah.
Because you will never be so fast that you can, jump from the rafters and knock the computer out of their hands and say, no, it's bad, you can't ship this. They need to be the one to make that call themselves. And you need to kind of shape the mental models of people around you to align on a shared definition of what that good thing looks like. And it's going to be different in every environment. This is why I struggle a lot with different frameworks, because people will say, just use this framework. And they will help you define good. And it's everything is so contextually dependent. Like that's what makes this job complex, right? Is everything is context, and context is everything. I can't tell you what to do because I don't know your context. If you are allowing the framework to tell you what to do, you're almost certainly doing the wrong thing. You need to choose your own goals first. You need to choose the goals that make sense for your environment, and then you need to find the tools that fit those goals. And some of those tools may be in one framework, some of those tools may be in another framework. I honestly think that once you have the goal, you don't need the frameworks. The tools they come to you themselves. They don't have to be very fancy. Cynefin is a 2x2, diagram. It's not that complicated. The most complicated thing about it is pronouncing the name. But it's for the right situation, it's all you need.
Right. Yeah. I'll say, and I realize we're getting to time, so we'll probably wrap it soon here, but what you're describing also is a really good example of, like a vector theory of change. Many of our listeners love this, right? Like it's a good example of that in the wild, rather than over relying on a predetermined sense of good, or like we talk a lot about. I know you're using goals a certain way here, but like getting away from truly target and goal driven, sort of teleological, and thinking more in that context dependent and ever kind of adjusting way, but a vector theory of change that can guide what good looks like from each step to the next step, and approaching what that is obliquely instead of having to predefine it up front. You're describing all of that and the way that can happen in the wild without having to use any of the jargon of the people who like to talk about this shit. And I just think it's a really good example of that. And I'll also say quickly, it's probably, you guys know this, but like earlier when I was like, it's not a given that people want to do a good job or create something good. I actually think it is, and I'm glad you said it the way you did, Pavel. It's worth calling out the difference between, I think, on an individual level, humans want to do good. We want to try, and we want to do good in the world, and we want to see that if we have an impact, it's a positive one. I operate on this model of always assume positive intent until proven otherwise. And I think that that's the only way that you can really effectively accomplish good things in the world. And it's interesting to think about where that dynamic then changes. At what point does it go from individuals who want to do good? Generally, most people want to put something good into the world, or very few people are like, I don't really care about this thing I'm working on such that I'm going to just put some garbage out. There are definitely situations where people are in a self-protective mode and have to just be like, do the thing and then go home. But at a point when it goes from a person to a system, where's that point, right? And then it's the system responding to its own internal coherence and system, incentives, and then you've got whatever capitalist economic dynamics making the system do X, and the individuals are in opposition as Y. And I think that is probably the interface that, like, it's not a physical thing. The virtual, philosophical, processual, like, interface from individual to system is where I think most of design is having its existential crisis right now. So it's an interesting way to see that, especially towards the end, as you were kind of describing. Context dependence is the name of the game. Okay, so being respectful of time, and we've got a nice long chat here behind us. We like to give you the last word. Is there anything, of course, we say thank you. This has been awesome. Very much appreciate the time. But we'll give you the last word. If there's anything else you want to say, now's your chance. Go ahead.
Well, I'll say that where my head has been recently is around process. And I think that in a way, Kinevin and the various frameworks, they're very good examples of process. Double Diamond is the one that's been under fire recently. They're really like canned ways of dealing with complexity by not dealing with it. It's like, well, if there's a situation, we will apply this thing to the situation. And I think that on the product side, agile methodologies and like ceremonies, and especially Scrum-ish derivatives like SAFe are extremely guilty of this, where just like whatever the situation is, let's spin up a product triad and put them on a 2-week cadence. Well, no, that's stupid. There's no framework like that works for every situation possible. It just doesn't exist. And conversely, when people are saying, "Oh, well, Double Diamond is dead, Agile is dead, everything is dead," no, it's also not dead. There are situations where it is legitimately useful, and being on either side of like always or never, it's most likely you're not going to have a very good outcome. You need to engage your brain and start dealing with the complexity instead of pushing it off onto someone else. And following a playbook feels really good, because even if you're not achieving anything, you can say, we did the thing. We did step 1 of 10, therefore we are 10% towards our outcomes. That's not how it works. But you kind of feel good about it. And letting go of that is really uncomfortable. And I think that's a big part of why everyone is just scared right now. And, I think that sitting with that and thinking about it is going to be necessary for everyone who wants to stop being uncomfortable. Is you have to face the discomfort. And yeah, we're in a very different context to the context that the past 30 years of technology has operated in. The context is not just based on the tools that we have. The context is on a variety of other factors, some of them economical, some of them regulatory, some of them financial. And some of them are just people are fed up with all the software getting worse and all the products getting worse. And we have to kind of respond to it not by doubling down on what we're most comfortable with, and not by intensifying all the ways we've been doing everything. And what I'm seeing from essentially everyone on LinkedIn, which is why I'm there a lot less than I used to be, is intensification of existing assumptions using new tools. And like, look at that, I created a multi-agent swarm. Well, your multi-agent swarm is just doing the same thing you were doing, but more. And that's what got us to where we are today in the first place. Do something different, do something that is not what you were doing. And a statistical engine is the worst thing for accomplishing that because all the biases and all the mistakes are baked into it now. And you can't just prompt it to not do that because that's the training data. That is the data set.
Yeah.
There's no shortcut out of using your brain, and I think that is the real thing. Designers should not pivot to strategy. Designers should pivot to thinking, and there's no tool that's going to do that on your behalf.
Mic drop. Engage your brain. That's the headline. I love it. Well, thank you. This has been awesome. Super fun.
Yeah. Thanks, Pavel.
I'm gonna hit stop and then we'll recover from all of it.